Yes, I think we're live.
So, welcome everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Future Scientist webinar, which will be about degrowth. My name is Federico Savini, and I'm an environmental planner working at the University of Amsterdam. And I'm here today with Leo van Kampenhout and Fabian Dablander, co-organizers of this mini-series on degrowth. This is the first episode of a series of 4 meetings about degrowth thinking. And we're very happy that you are interested in this idea. These 4 meetings will take place at a distance of 2 weeks each, between now and Christmas, basically. And the first one will introduce you to the theme of degrowth. We will discuss in a second what degrowth means and why it's different from an idea of green growth. The second one, which will take place in 2 weeks on a Thursday, I will mention this again at the end of this meeting, we'll talk about different perspectives that the degrowth idea opens up. And the third one will talk about policies, so concrete policy actions for a degrowth agenda. And the fourth one will have a panel discussion about degrowth policies and strategies in the Netherlands in particular. So please stay tuned with us along the 4 meetings, because at the end of the 4 meetings, you will have very much, hopefully, a much clearer idea of what degrowth means. Just one other note about the organization. This series of meetings is organized by, indeed, Leo, me, and Fabian, but also, let's say, organized by a cooperation of organizations, Scientists for Future Netherlands, of course, that is hosting this webinar today, but also the Ontgroei Association, the Degrowth Association of the Netherlands. Please look at the website of this organization. They have a lot of tools, a lot of resources in their website, and also Scientist Rebellion, which is also a network where many scientists are involved, Scientist Rebellion NL. Please also visit their website if you're interested. Just before introduce Crelis, why we did a series on degrowth. Well, the term degrowth, post-growth has gained a lot of momentum worldwide in policy debates today. It has a long history, but we see now that it's becoming a concrete and viable proposal for interrupting the climate and biodiversity crisis we're living in. The IPCC report, the last one, actually mentions degrowth 25 times in the report. I counted them, and it offers degrowth as one of the possible scenarios or pathways to reduction of environmental effects of our economies. So we think it's very important to dig into these terms, explain clearly where it comes from, what it means, and also explain what are the implications of using this term in policy making concretely. And to help us doing this, today we have Crelis Rammelt. He is a colleague of mine. He's an assistant professor in environmental geography and development studies at the University of Amsterdam. And he's one of the main thinkers of degrowth in the Netherlands. He's also co-founder of the Ontgroei Association, which I just mentioned. And he works at the interface between degrowth thinking and in development studies. So also thinking in terms of uneven development globally and relations between global north and global south, and so on. So thank you, Crelis, for being here with us. Just before giving you the word, I ask the audience to post questions for the debate after Crelis' lecture already, whenever you want, on the Mentimeter link that is available under the YouTube video that you're watching. We will collect this question. You can post them already at the beginning. We will collect them and post them at the end of the talk. So thank you for now. Crelis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Federico. I'll share my screen. There we go. Right. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to introduce this series. Looking forward to the rest of it as well. So I have the task to say a little bit about the analysis of degrowth, which is, so I'm not going to talk about the degrowth alternatives and options, but I did want to call my talk Abundance Through Degrowth, to start already pointing out this critique, right? This critique that degrowth is something of a sacrifice, and I want to tackle that critique by saying that it is not, or starting to point out that it is not a sacrifice. It would not be a sacrifice for many people who are currently sort of not having enough, and therefore also tackle the argument that green growth will be the preferred option. So and I want to therefore bring in, next to this environmental concern, right? I'm going to talk about degrowth versus green growth, which is an environmental issue, but I want to bring in the justice perspective, which in our view cannot be separated from the environmental concerns. So I think this is a very diverse group listening in. So so forgive me if I go either too slow or too fast, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments at the end. Let's start big picture. Jumping right in. So this is a picture of the Earth, and we have the Earth system with its so-called universal metabolism, with all these cycles of the water cycle, carbon cycle, nutrient cycle, energy cycles, and they're all connected. For example, when you have decaying matter that's being recycled using the energy of the sun. And we're borrowing here the term metabolism, which refers to all these chemical reactions that are involved in maintaining the state of an organism and its cells. So we use that term metabolism to talk about this biosphere. Here comes the human economy, the social system, which is embedded in the environment. It is open to the entry of energy and materials on one side, and to the exit of waste and pollution on the other side. Martinez, Allier, and others refer to it as social metabolism, and ecological economists talk about the throughput, right? And this throughput has grown, and for a while, the Earth system can buffer, right, our extraction of resources, and can process our wastes, but that will come up against limits. And the idea of limits is not just that at some point the stuff is empty and we don't have it, we can't, or the waste bin is full, or that the resource extraction is finished. It also has to do with this idea of the quality of the flows that go in and the quality of the flows that go out, and that's an issue of so-called entropy. High quality, concentrated energy, that is called low entropy. Matter and energy come into the system, and dissipated, that is called high entropy. It's a bit counterintuitive, but high entropy, dissipated, low quality matter and energy dissipate back into the environment. So one example is about 30,000 trees per day come into the system and are being flushed at the other end as toilet paper. So you can imagine that the quality of the wood coming in and the toilet paper at the end is of a different sort. Another example, the obvious example, is climate change. So we take out this concentration of high concentrated energy in the form of fossil fuels, we burn that, and what comes out at the other hand is carbon emissions, highly dissipated energy in the form of emissions, microplastics, and all sorts of other chemicals. So this throughput, which is qualitative and quantitative, starts to create all sorts of disturbances in this universal metabolism. It creates what some refer to as rifts in that global metabolism. So, for example, the early division between the urban and the rural caused all sorts of problems of nutrients not returning back to the farm and concentrating nutrients in the cities and producing all sorts of harmful effects. With the global system, food system, this rift has obviously further widened. Brett Clark and Richard York talk about this thing called the carbon rift, where we are very quickly, in geological terms, disrupting oil, coal, and gas deposits, which are part of a 100 to 200 million year slow carbon cycle. So here we have that in another way, sort of quantitatively showing this in a material sense. You have the flows going in, the flows going out, and the stocks of accumulated matter and energy in the social system. As you see, all of it grows exponentially. Here you see the data from 1900 to 2015 in gigaton per year flows, or gigaton accumulated in our economic systems, in our infrastructures, in our products and stuff like that. So the obvious observation is that this economic system that we have has grown into this gigantic beast that's devouring on one side, the raw materials on a global scale, and then discharges these sorts of mountains of waste back on the other side. About 8% of the outflows are recycled within that system globally. And this beast, this economic system, does not seem to respond, or at least inadequately responds to the depletion and the pollution of its own habitat, to use the same analogy. So that means that this has been going on for a while. So the system will have to undergo a sort of radical or evolutionary transformation before it's able to control its own growth. Until it's able to do that, the biophysical growth will start to hit these hard ecological limits. That is old news. We've known this, for a long time, since, started, for example, the limits to growth in the early 70s. These limits have to do with our metabolism. So again, either what comes in, oil that runs out, or forests and soil life that's being used up faster than it grows back, etc. Or it has to do with the waste pits, right? So the waste bioaccumulates in the environments, or accumulates faster than nature can convert it back into a resource, so solar powered. This limits to growth study has sort of been rediscovered a bit recently, maybe because it was 50 years old now. And there's been some studies here that I'm showing some of the data here on the right that show a very close empirical fit with what the model was doing with its scenarios. So the possibility of collapse to natural resources in 2012, there was a study that looked at that, and then a more recent study that showed that actually collapse due to pollution, or one of the scenarios in the limits to growth report, or maybe more preferably a slower decline, not a collapse, but a slower decline due to rising cost of technology. But either way, growth will end. That is the message of this report. And then a more recent approach that I'm sure most of you, maybe all of you, know, is this idea of planetary boundaries. In 2009, the first article came out showing, I think, 4 transgressions in biosphere integrity, which is biodiversity, land use change, mostly deforestation or forest degradation, that kind of process, and then climate change and the disruption of these phosphorus and nitrogen flows. And here we have an image of 2002 updates with novel entities and fresh water as new boundaries that are being transgressed. The novel entities one relates to environmental pollutants, including plastics, that have to do with this tremendous increase of the production of chemicals in the last 75 or 100 years. And fresh water, it's green water that we know of as a global limit, and green water is the water that's available to plants, and that's being transgressed because of the widespread evidence that changes in soil moisture and things like that. So the planetary boundaries is another of these approaches that is trying to indicate that we are moving beyond certain thresholds. So there's a difference here between the limits to growth types of limits and these planetary boundaries in this sense. So this is where I'm trying to show this, that planetary boundaries provide these sort of guardrail idea that it keeps us from a safe distance of hard limits and precipices and tipping points and dangerous thresholds that we might otherwise go to. So you see there's some distance here between the guardrail, the planetary boundaries, and the tipping points. And actually, you want to stay also far away from the guardrail. You don't want to drive against the guardrail either. And there's a recent paper that came out that I think a couple of weeks ago, showing that even at 1.5 warming, that there's a severe risk of tipping points. already occurring. And so risk, I use the term risk because that's the language, that's the method. It's about risks, what is the risk that we are willing to take? How far do we want to take this in terms of risks, and staying far away from these hard limits. We don't know exactly where the hard limits are, but we know that they're there and we want to be. So planetary boundaries is not a limit, it's a sort of called a soft limit in a sense. That would be a difference. Now, many disagree with this limits narrative, either because they say that there are no limits, that there's only scarcity of resources which can be resolved through markets and more technology, or better technology, efficiency, all of that. Which means that that green or sustainable growth can respect those boundaries, or the planetary boundaries. That's the view. And this idea of green growth, it rests on a pretty basic hypothesis that's called decoupling. And the idea is that you have economic growth, exponential economic growth, that's the exponential line going up, and then you have resource use or emissions, or the environmental pressures and impacts, which grows together with growing economies, and then you have no decoupling on the left. Relative decoupling is this scenario where the growth of the environmental impacts grow, but they grow less fast than economic growth. So it's doing slightly less harm, you could say. And where green growth wants to go is towards absolute decoupling. They want to go to a scenario where the resource use declines, or the impacts decline, while the economic output grows. So in relation to planetary boundaries, you could say that we've transgressed these boundaries. Green growth would want us to have the impacts go back into the safe zones while we continue having economic growth. And that's called absolute decoupling. So there's some assumption also that if we do relative decoupling better and better, eventually we will get to absolute decoupling. There's a bit of an assumption there as well. So what do degrowthers and other critics say about this is that, as far as we can see, there have been for a very long time very strong correlations between the average economic growth rate, which you see here, the black squiggly line, and average growth rate of emissions, the dotted orange line. And there's a strong correlation, very strong correlation between the two. And you see basically that these lines are following each other, and there's a financial crisis in 2007, 2008, emissions fall. Same with COVID, there's a fall of economic growth, and then there's a fall of the emissions rate as well. So you have to imagine that what absolute decoupling means is that scenario totally on the right, in terms of emissions being negative growth rate of emission, while the economic growth rate is up there somewhere. So this is sort of unprecedented, at least in history, right? Don't see that. We do see that the average economic growth rate is higher than the average emissions growth rate. And that means, this graph, that means that we have globally relative decoupling. We have that scenario where emissions are growing, but more slowly than the global economy. And again, I've shown you this image here in the top left, is that green growth wants to go to that scenario where you have absolute decoupling, where you would see that the dotted orange line actually fall. Now, one argument that degrowthers often get in return is that, well, these are past correlations. It doesn't mean this, it's perhaps like more of a warning, that's okay, we need to do our best to actually have future absolute decoupling, right? So past correlations don't say anything about the future. Now, looking at the future, could it still happen? Here's some like one of the graphs that's often sort of shown as, look, since the year 2000, here we have 21 countries, the best performing countries in terms of growth and reduction of emissions, economic growth and emission reductions. And if you look at what they achieved, and these are the best performing countries, So they achieve in 14 years an average of 1.15% emissions reduction. And while the IPCC recommends that for a 66% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees, we would need global emissions to fall by 10% per year, and even more if you also assume global economic growth. So we are far from the best performing countries are far from achieving that level of decoupling. Also, this particular image, one thing that you need to be on the outlook for is that these are only the territorial greenhouse gas emissions, so not the emissions in other countries that produce for our consumption. There's also evidence of some countries of absolute decoupling in that sense, but it's then the levels are even lower, the levels of decoupling. And also, this is a bit of a side note, but it's important too, is to realize that this is a reduction in flow of emissions, right? So the accumulated stock is still there, and that eventually needs to sort of come down too. So the conclusion is that absolute decoupling from emissions cannot be achieved fast enough, at least, right? So we can achieve absolute decoupling. Countries can do that. Transition to renewables, fine, abandon fossil fuels. So in theory, that's possible, but if we look at this, it cannot be achieved fast enough to respect these global carbon budgets. And so that is a doubt about the capacity to decouple absolutely for emissions. Now, decoupling is not only about emissions, it's also supposed to be about decoupling our resource use, resource extraction, also having huge, tremendous impacts on, for example, biodiversity and things like that. So as for resources, there's no resource decoupling. In fact, it's the opposite that seems to be happening. The material footprints, which take into account this upstream material resource use, is growing faster than our economy. So our economies are becoming more material intensive. It could be because we are outsourcing to less efficient countries. I've seen this explanation, or it could be because you need more and more energy to extract material resources that are becoming scarcer. That's another explanation, but this is something we could discuss. So again, the question there is, what about future decoupling? So far, we see an energy addition, not a transition. We see renewable energies coming on top of the fossil fuel carriers, and that is, of course, also within the context of neoliberal capitalism, very understandable, because there's this fear that of these trillions of losses in stranded fossil fuel assets and resources. So, and not an easy thing within the current growth system to really have this transition and not just an addition. And even if we could transition and get rid of fossil fuels, leave fossil fuels on the ground and go for renewables, those green energy sources are not benign necessarily. Here's an example of the lithium fields in Chile. The International Energy Association expects that if we want to manufacture electric vehicles by 2040, the lithium demand will increase 42 times relative to current levels. So there's all this debate about the Green New Deal and about the problems of in a highly unequal world, growth in the north, including green growth in the north, could lead to all sorts of injustices and distribution of benefits and burdens to have that transition happen. Now, so there's these inequalities in obviously in sort of this purchasing power for green energy, for example. So I want to start bringing in a bit of that justice dimension, and in a very simple way here, look at income inequality, which is a very superficial way, but to start thinking about justice, the purchasing power around the world is increasingly unequal, right? So the rich, the top 20% earners earn 65% of the income in 2019. And that is the outcome of a growing inequality, where the top 20% grew 6.2 times more than the bottom 60% since 1980. So there's growing global inequality. And these inequalities are, of course, not only economic, but also ecological. And here's a way to look at that. So the message here is we are not equally responsible for transgressing these boundaries or for going across these limits. It's a global economic system that connects overconsumption in one place to underconsumption in another place. So here, so we see a huge increase in the volume of trade, over the last couple of 100 years. But high-income countries have imported more flows of embodied materials, energy, embodied land, embodied labor, all these resources that you need to produce stuff. They have the high-income countries have imported more than they exported. So here's an example in the graph that the net trade of raw material resources over time in that period from 1990 to 2015. So you see that purple bar on the right, the bar plot, you see that the high-income countries accumulated more, I think 215 or something billion tons of raw materials in excess of domestic extraction in that period. Meanwhile, the low-income countries on the green one and the orange one, India, low middle-income countries, if you add them up, low and lower middle-income countries, they've all exported almost 90 billion tons of raw material in excess of what they get in return. So this drain of material resources deprives the poor in the global south, in these so-called developing countries, of vital resources, and it damages also local ecosystems and their services, right? Think of that lithium mine. So growing income inequality, which I showed in the previous slide, is really symptomatic of this underlying material reality that's going on of what's called net appropriation of resources by high income countries. You might say, okay, they export more. Well, that's good. No, they earn more, but the exchange itself is not equal. So there's a lot of different kinds of studies that look at this with relatively lower prices and wages in the developing countries. Every unit every unit of import that the South gets from the North has to be paid for with many, many more units of exports. And here this study estimates with different methodologies, but here's one that estimates the South's losses at 2.2 trillion in 2017, which is enough to end poverty about 15 times over. So the resulting lack of access to minimum resources in the global South, in developing countries, follows from this growing unequal exchange, or ecologically unequal exchange, as it's called. And this unequal exchange enables, on one side, the net appropriation and overconsumption in the North, right? And on the other side, it sort of undermines this lack of minimum resources and access in the global South. So we need to think about redistribution, and we need to degrowth, or thinking about degrowth needs to tackle this net appropriation, and alongside thinking about tackling overconsumption by the rich. It's also about this relation with the South that needs to be brought in as well in degrowth, and many degrowthers are doing that, I think, bringing that in the thinking. And yet, well, hopefully, tackling that would free up the resources for where they are needed. We can discuss that. I have also questions there. So in other words, here's another one. I'm not going to go into details here, but you see also, you can have a similar sort of story on the output side of the high entropy wastes and emissions that flow. On the other side, there's also a sort of unequal allocation of that, of the burdens, of the responsibilities for the waste, and eventually also of the burdens of climate change. It's also unequally distributed. Now, if you remember this one, some are adding this idea of an inner ring. So we also need to achieve these inner social foundations. It's not just about bringing back into the planetary boundaries, bringing back into the safe, but there's also this minimum social foundations, minimum material living standards that people would have to achieve. And the donut economy is one of a great symbol for that, an idea to bring that shortfall back to minimum levels for water, food, health, healthcare, political voice, income, etc. So some have asked the question, like, what would it mean for the planetary boundaries if all countries would achieve the minimum social floors? And again, different methodologies. Here's one of them, showing that to meet social thresholds, these minimum access to resources would lead to further transgressions and of the planetary boundaries, and immediately they give the responsibility for tackling that additional transgression to nations that are already overshooting, right? So it's the overshoot nations that need to compensate for the extra pressure that will come from meeting social thresholds, from resolving poverty, to say it simply. The good news, and I think it's not in my talk, but the good news is that that doesn't have to be a sacrifice for the overshoot nations. Degrowth can be a positive thing, but I'm not going to talk about that now. We have to think about the meaning of these thresholds very carefully. I think I'm looking at the time, so I want to keep it a bit short and have enough time for discussion. But I want to point out that we really have to think about what do we mean by these minimum thresholds. An international poverty line is very, very low. It's not enough to actually survive, to afford a healthy diet, etc. So we need to have proper minimum thresholds and we need to move beyond the money metric. We need to think about the other factors besides income that bear on minimum access to things, like the provision of public goods, the free services from nature, such as clean air and potable water, etc., pollinators, stable climate, all these things. And the right image here shows that, unfortunately, since the 1970s, we see a decline in 14 of the 17 categories of these natural free contributions, like the ecosystem services for people. And I want again remind you that this loss of ecosystem services is connected to the material resource extraction that has been going on for a long time, and which has affected these local ecosystems. So we need to reflect on that too, not just the money metric. I'm going to skip this one. So we have this argument from degrowth. I'm starting to wrap up a bit here. We have this elaborate. We have this degrowth argument for reducing overconsumption in the north. We should add to that it's not just about these consumption footprints. It's also about this global system where profits have been accumulating and allowing investments by the super rich after they spend on their own, Mac mansions and yachts, and they invest this money in a world economy with the obvious intention to make a profit. So if you look at investments that they do in the financial economy, that's a whole different story that I'm not going to get into. But if we look at investments in the actual real sort of physical material economy, those investments are leading to major land and resource grabs and displacements. They lead to a so-called race to the bottom, where all the environmental and social costs of production are externalized either to people who don't have a political voice to fight it, or to future generations. And these investments again occur in this context of global unequal exchange. So that finally brings me to degrowth, the deliberate downscaling of overproduction and overconsumption. So it's not a financial crisis. We're not looking at a crisis of capitalism, at the financial crisis or COVID crisis. It's deliberate, it's planned. And it's focusing on overproduction, overconsumption. So it's not about stopping a poor Bangladeshi from growing its material standards of living. Let's make that very clear. Then it's to increase non-human and human well-being while enhancing social justice and respecting those boundaries. So again, as I started my talk, it sounds maybe a bit of a story about limitations, boundaries, and all sorts of things that may come across as negative. But the degrowth movement, and I think future talks will show this, is that it can also be liberating, like you could get rid of an addiction or something like that. It's a deliberate reduction in that material sense, but it's also deliberate reduction in commodification, the extreme marketization, alienation, exploitation, extreme workloads, and all of these things. So in that sense, degrowth could be very positive for well-being. And I think I'll leave it at that. Yes.
Thank you, Crelis. Thank you very much. I think you made very, very clear how the current course of action and strategies are not delivering at the speed and size necessary to actually really solve the problems we're facing. So in the meanwhile that we collect questions, I can immediately break the ice and maybe just ask you the first one. So you didn't mention the C word, capitalism. And I was surprised, but I would like to know, how is the position of degrowth with regards to profit, market, to regards property, all these terms that actually are extremely relevant, and also that creates strong path dependencies in the way we deal with environmental issues. So can you reflect on that?
I think I mentioned capitalism, maybe capital once, but I agree. I'm careful with it, because I think the message can also actually be made without necessarily using the C word. But I agree that once you go down this path into thinking, you have to end up thinking about capitalism, because that's the system that requires growth. Like, why do we have even economic growth? So that is the underlying operating system of the economy, which is capitalism, the dominant one. It's not the only one. And I think that's where degrowth alternatives are looking for alternatives. But it's a very dominant one. It marketizes everything. So it commodifies life. It commodifies these resources that, for example, these ecosystems and their services that used to be free. For many people, it starts to commodify them and stop them from being accessible. So we have all this story, and then it operates on a global scale. And this whole story of unequal exchange is very much rooted in Marxist analysis of the world system and how it operates and how it extracts value in the sense of labor time, how it extracts what Marx calls use values in terms of resources, what he called, primitive accumulation, what others have said, it's still occurring on a global scale, like land grabs, resource grabs. So all of that story is definitely very much embedded in that critical, perspective on what capitalism is. I'm not talking about communism. I'm talking about Marxist analysis of the capitalist system. And then there is, I should also mention, within degrowth, so the ecological sort of theories is one big influence, ecological economics and other sort of theories within that play a big role in degrowth thinking for a long time. Marxist theories come in as well as an important group. And then you also have anarchist thinking and anarchist theories, which is not really my field, but there's also then, building on that Marxist critique, you can then also start critiquing the role of the state in this whole thing, and how it cooperates with capital, and how it sort of keeps things in place, or so there's also that sort of critique coming in. So there's many more layers of critique that I haven't discussed here. There's a feminist analysis, and maybe I've touched a little bit on sort of this decolonial or post-development, what's called, perspectives on the relationship between the countries of the North and the South, but there's many more. And it's interesting because I think that maybe the reason why I don't start straight off with capitalism is also because of the way I came to it. I came to it more from an engineering perspective, that I started realizing that there are limits. Okay, there's these limits to growth, and growth was very abstract, and technology can't solve all these things. Technology can't do this green growth thing. So I came from there, and this the capitalist system, it for me as a point of analysis came much later. So I think I therefore maybe telling the story starting from there, taking it step by step. But maybe others strategically could choose another way. There's so many different ways.
No, but as you said, it's a very complex infrastructure of critique. So actually, just to mention, the next meeting in 2 weeks will also provide other different perspective on this complex story. There's a question from the audience which points out that the issue that you actually discussed already a bit in your presentation, the relation between global north and global south, countries of late and early industrialization, etc. So can you develop a bit more your idea on what would be the implication of a degrowth in the global north or in countries of early industrialization for countries, for emerging economies? So what would happen if the global north would start degrowing seriously now?
Yeah, that's a very good point, very good question. So what I'm raising, I realized as I was preparing that this is raising some questions definitely that need to be thought through more. So the first sort of straw man argument critique is that degrowth that we get as degrowth is how can you say that that poor people can't grow? So I made that point, right? So the poor countries know there is insufficient material standards of living to support all this access to minimum resources. So that has to grow for sure. And even within northern or other economies, there's also groups of people that don't have enough that should have their income grow. So there's a lot of families in the Netherlands that can't pay the energy bill. So we're not saying degrow, they should degrow, they should make more sacrifices that they can't make. So this is one point. So if you talk about north-south relationships, back to that, there is then another critique sometimes degrowthers say it themselves, then no, degrowth is only something for the global north. Some degrowth, I'm charging a bit, but some degrowthers could say that because, and they're right, the global north is most responsible for the environmental impact. But I think that maybe tends to forget that relational thing, that whole global system of net appropriation and extraction of resources from the global south. Then tackling overconsumption in the north that reduces demand from the north for a lot of these products that are produced in the south. And then the question, sometimes we get the question, well, if you're reducing consumption in the north, it's going to harm all these producers in the south because they can't have a livelihood anymore. They're producing your stuff. If you look at this story of unequal exchange, it's actually the south that is continuing to develop the north. It's not the other way around. So it is possible that actually downscaling, degrowing this unequal relationship between north and south could free up the resources in the south. But this is a big question. Maybe not. Maybe if the degrowth movement here in the Netherlands is super successful, there's a big labor rights, and we're reducing working time. We're taxing the rich, putting all sorts of income ceilings. That could lead capital, and here the word capitalism should come in. It'll find another way to make that profit and that surplus. And that could actually make it worse for the countries of the South, for the growth of the countries in the South. But does growth of a country in the South automatically mean that the poor in those countries are benefiting? Or if there's no growth, GDP in the global South, does it mean that what's happening to the poor within those countries? There's a huge question there too. So I think that degrowth or post-growth thinking is actually highly relevant, both for the relationship between North and South, but also for the meaning of growth and the benefits and burdens of economic growth in, say, Bangladesh. I would answer it in that way.
No, it's very clear. I actually agree very much with you in this. So there's still questions about the geopolitics of degrowth. Let me pose another one just to reiterate the challenge somehow. So it seems like degrowth requires some sort of coordinated action globally, actually, I imagine, between different countries, somehow going towards the same goal, which is reducing their material throughput and their impact, and achieving social standards, of course. But how can we achieve that coordination? So what if some countries of Europe start degrowing, and then we see actually an increase in environmental exploitation and social exploitation in other countries? So emerging economies, China, India, or countries like Africa, where actually these debates are not mature or not developed as much as countries in some countries of Europe. So how do we do? Where do we start, and how can we coordinate this action between countries, in your view?
I don't know. No, I think this, it depends on, like, on who you speak to, that you have, everybody has their preferences, right? So some people really trust or believe that there can be a lot of things that you can do from this global governance perspective, to change the rules of the global economy, global trade, and to do something with third world with global south debt and all of those kind of issues. That there's and that's important work, and then others, I think I'm more on that camp, that believe that it's going to be more something, a transformation that will emerge from the bottom up, is where I personally have a preference. I think that especially because when I look around, there is already so much going on. There's actually a lot going on in the cracks of the system that is very promising, and a lot of initiatives. So I've had many students that go and that went and did a sort of degrowth perspective on energy cooperatives or regenerative agricultural farms or things like that in the Netherlands. And even though they don't call themselves degrowth, which is totally fine, they do share those principles. And actually, I told you the other day, I was having a conversation with a large infrastructure or a representative from a large infrastructure organization in the sustainability department, and he also said the same thing. He actually said, "Why do we have to grow all the time? And we can't. We don't have the capacity. And now, how liberating it would be if we don't have this continuous sort of push that we need to do all this good stuff while also growing." And I think this may be also true for many farmers and for a lot of energy cooperatives that need to compete and all of that. So again, I think that there are all these things. But this is initiatives in the south, and maybe it has to. I think the simple answer, it has to start everywhere at the same time. And it is going on everywhere at the same time. And so there's these initiatives in the global north. There's all these various initiatives of environmental justice and all these things happening in the global south. They are also connecting quite a bit through one of many, these degrowth networks. There's even a couple of degrowth networks arising in the global south, which also see the relevance of it. And then you have this global governance, even national policy level stuff need to happen there, so that the initiatives that we feel would need to have more space, and the initiatives that we feel need to grow, can have space to grow. And that the initiatives that as a society we feel, I don't know, that's a democratic discussion, that we feel should actually downscale, like private jets, to name the obvious one, that should degrow. I don't want to name any other ones because it might get me in trouble. But yeah. So I think the answer is it has to happen everywhere at the same time, and you just start where you have your preference. I think that's.
This leads me actually to another question, which was already posed several times in the chat. So basically, the degrowth idea is still not mainstream clearly in the debate, in the public debate in many countries. Actually, I'm not sure if there's any country which mainstreamed already this idea. I don't think so. The mainstream idea is still that more is better, because if we enlarge the cake, we can give peace for everybody. And also the idea that technology at one point will save us, and that we can't change the structures that govern the economy today. It's so we have such a degree of integration of this idea in our mind that we still think indeed that material consumption, for example, is a proxy of well-being as well. So it's very difficult from this point of view to implement a degrowth agenda. So at what level would you start, if we take in consideration all these different dimensions, the culture, the politics, the economy? So what are the leverages that can be used to make this idea?
I don't know. I often think that if you talk again, degrowth as abundance, that there's a large group of people in the Netherlands and worldwide, obviously worldwide, that fail to reach these levels of access that are sufficient. And degrowth, if you can immediately say that it's a story of redistribution, a story of justice, rebalancing things, that it actually would increase the material standards of living where it's needed, I think suddenly you would get a lot of support for that story, from those people, not from a smaller group of people that is more interested in keeping the things going the way they're going. And I think I was mentioning that I came through to this topic through the technology discussion in industrial engineers, which I have a degree in that industrial design engineers. A lot of them are trained to actually produce these goods that fall apart very quickly. And who is that? Is that serving? Whose interest is that serving? It's obviously not serving the interest of the regular sort of consumer. It's serving the interest of profit. So the thing is, I think, to get more support for the stories, to show these kind of stories, and to break down these counter arguments that but planned obsolescence is good for innovation. That's how we get better products. These are sort of manipulations and that's a big fight, right? So there's a constant fight. Also, I think that's where anarchism also has an interesting thing to say about the violence that this system is doing, and how difficult it is for that counter narrative to actually make the point. You get constantly then bombarded with a counter argument that, like that example with planned obsolescence, that it's good for innovation, it's good for growth, and growth is good. So yeah, I think.
Yeah, just a quick maybe remark, quick feedback on this. Do you think would be a way to actually stress very much how the degrowth story is a story of social justice and redistribution of wealth? Would it be that a way to indeed mainstream this degrowth agenda, saying that this is not only about reaching, planetary boundaries, bringing back the economy, but it's also increasing all those the wealth, or indeed, of all those groups that today don't meet basic needs?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, because I think I had to rush a bit through those last slides, but that was the point I wanted to make. Exactly that okay, we need to have degrowth to get back into the safe, because we are transgressing these boundaries, get back into the safe space, and we have to further degrow, or though not we, but those that have too much have to further degrow so as to allow more material growth at the other end, where people don't have enough, without that further worsening the environmental problems. So it must be immediately, and that's why I started with that point, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because I have to finish with that point too, or we have to mention that point again, that the environmental issue must immediately be linked to a issue of redistribution, not charity, but actual redistribution of responsibilities and impacts and burdens and sharing of those kind of things. So again, it's so clear for me now. So with this whole energy situation in the Netherlands, that you hear this narrative that we all have to make a sacrifice. It's not fair. It's not possible. First of all, many people can't degrow further their energy consumption. Some people definitely can. When I see all the electricity and energy that's being wasted in certain places, I think, there's so many. If you were asking, before, where do we start? I would start with those low-hanging fruits. Stop these humongous LED advertising things that are, first of all, consuming a lot of electricity, and second of all, just inducing us to consume more.
Yeah.
So that's the simple one. It's a small thing, but it just as an example of this. I think when you start to look, really, there's potentially a lot of low-hanging fruits that would be good for society, not so good for capital. But and that's where the struggle is all the time, I think.
Yeah, very clear. There was a question about teaching. I guess in the audience are also many scholars which teach, and not only in the social sciences, but also in other disciplines. So how would you, what kind of suggestions would you give to these teachers that would like to integrate degrowth thinking within disciplines like engineer, geosciences, earth sciences, maybe disciplines that are less familiar with the policy making processes or processes of socioeconomic restructuring? So I don't know, how would you suggest them to approach this degrowth literature?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, well, the what you pointed out also in your introduction is that you have all these different perspectives, and I hope that some of those perspectives came out of now that it's a good, for me, I came to this topic of degrowth because I started seeing the word degrowth appear in literature on sort of engineering technology, appropriate technology, all sorts of sort of technological debate, the ecological debate, the world systems debates. I started seeing the word degrowth pop up, and then degrowth for me became this umbrella, and I think it's an umbrella for many people. So the nice thing about a degrowth conference is that you will have all these different disciplines there. So I think for every discipline, there's potentially a nice way to approach it and to bring it into teaching. It's such a huge, it's almost, I mean, maybe simplifying, it's almost such an area, it doesn't really matter from which angle you approach it, you approach it, and then that perspective becomes part of a bigger system. So I think maybe, well, I still like very much the first book on degrowth, that green book, the vocabulary, was it? Or it's called Degrowth, a new vocabulary.
Yeah, vocabulary of degrowth, I think.
That's a nice place to look, because it has all these different chapters that are focusing on different dimensions of the issue. And so you can start by reading, it's a very short chapter, so you can start by reading a chapter there, and then go from there. Pick a chapter that fits with your particular discipline. So I think that would be the way to go. It's a huge space, and like I said also before, I approached it more from an ecological economics perspective at first, engineering within that, and then this whole issue of post-development and critical Marxist perspective on capitalism, all of that came later, and I'm sure my journey will continue with many more of these perspectives, because I like looking at these different perspectives. But for teaching, yes, I think that there's good opportunities. I don't know exactly how to answer the question about what sort of advice I would give, but maybe this is just a tip. Yeah.
Oh yeah, of course, it's clear. There was, I mean, we still have 2 minutes, and I would like just to ask a quick one, because Leo, one of the moderator of this session, also posted the question. He was reflecting on the 1.5 degree, guardrail, that the metaphor that you used. So he says, this is a bit of a political guardrail. It's kind of a, number that somehow everybody can grasp, but it's not so concrete. Shouldn't be the guardrail more a hard measure of, for example, a maximum amount of particles of CO2, or a measure of, maximum number of flights, maximum number of resources and materials that can be used to extract it? How would you approach these policies that are more, setting hard limits on from a
interesting? That's an interesting question. Of course, that these are the outcome of all sorts of risk analysis and models that come then with this particular number, and it's a temperature change which is affected by all sorts of things, and mainly emissions of carbon into the atmosphere. But so you can then translate it back into, okay, what is the cap? And I think one of the slides did that. Like, what is the percentage that you would like to reduce the emissions? But it's true that, and then that becomes part of this whole political negotiations. Where can we set a limit that people will still sort of feel that they can actually achieve it or not? Same with the poverty line, I think. Where do you set the minimum threshold? These are important questions, but there's an interesting, also within degrowth, in this interesting discussion, that some are slowly saying, well, we can also forget about all these external limits discussion. We can really focus on what is it to live the good life, and start breaking down this narrative that we always want more, for example, or so that to start with that, and our internal sort of limitless behavior, and that, so there's a discussion within degrowth to even forget about all those hard limits, to not even talk about them anymore. I'm a bit ambivalent. I think both need to happen, and I agree that I think I don't know, this is maybe another discussion, but I think that the whole idea of having targets, what is the role of targets for policy, and how do you set them? How do you evaluate? How do you assess them? Are you flexible to adjust the targets? All of this is more of a governance kind of story, I think. Yeah. But it's relevant. So it's a good question because it's relevant also for degrowth, but it's relevant, I think, for a lot of things.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Crelis. It's a good, I would say, a good conclusion. Also, it's a good hand to the next meetings, which will indeed unpack really specifically these questions of toolkits of degrowth and, if possible, instruments that can be mobilized, policy instruments, etc., etc. So I thank you very much for this introduction to the world of degrowth.
Thank you for the invitation.
Extremely clear. I hope people will also watch this video offline, or let's say later on. That it will remain available on the YouTube channel of the Future Scientist webinars. So thank you again, Crelis. I invite also the audience to look at your work directly to see what you wrote and where this presentation comes from. I also thank Leo and Fabian for helping organizing this series. And well, with this, I will close the meeting for today. And thank you for listening to the audience. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.